Okay, I think we're going to get started. First of all, I want to say hi to everybody and thank you all for joining us today for our very first local Lunch and Learn series today with American Printing House, APH. We're really excited to have this wonderful organization joining us today. This series is really about recognizing and highlighting the great work of the many partners that World Affairs Council works with throughout the years, and really giving them a chance to share the ways that they work to enrich our community. And then for the WAC members, it really provides us with the chance to learn more about the vast resources we have available in our region, which most of us do not know about. So my name is Xiaoyan Zhao. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. We are a hub for international exchange, dialogue, and learning in Louisville, Kentucky. As a member of 3 national networks, Global Ties US, the World Affairs Councils of America, and our newest one, Sister Cities International, our organization facilitates a variety of international professional and youth exchanges, speaker programs, and educational opportunities for the Kentuckiana region year-round. Our organization is a member-supported organization. We are not, however, member-exclusive in our programs, which are all open to the public. So our goal is really to ensure that our community has access to expert analysis and quality discussion on topics that impact us locally, nationally, and globally, especially during this pandemic. And we are, again, very excited to kick off this series today by learning more about APH, the American Printing House for the Blind. We have with us Mike Hudson, who is the director of the museum. Mike will be sharing the work of APH with us, and especially as a collection on Helen Keller and her role as an international social justice advocate. Mike has been the director of the museum since 2005, and he has a MA in the history of technology from the University of Delaware, and has been working in the museum field for more than 30 years. Welcome, Mike.
I'm glad to be here.
Yes, of course. We're excited to have you. Now, before we get started, I just want to do a quick reminder about the functionalities and the run of show today. And this webinar is recorded, and we are live streaming on Facebook. Mike will take us through a 20-minute presentation, which will be followed by Q&A for up to 30 minutes. Please note that you can submit questions at any time during this program, and Mike will answer as many as time allows. If you prefer, you can also ask your question verbally. You just have to raise your hand and your controls, and we will unmute you. So without further ado, I will now go ahead and turn it over to Mike to start his presentation. Mike, please take it over.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna share my screen here a little bit. Here we go. So thank you. I want to thank the World Affairs Council for letting me come speak to you guys today. So when we bring visitors into APH for our factory tour and museum, we are trying to change their minds, their attitudes, and their actions about education and literacy for students who are blind and visually impaired. When our visitors arrive, most only know one story. It's the story of Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan and the water pump. Keller's story and that of her teacher is that one perfect story that makes a lasting impression. Now, the water pump is a reference to that incredible moment in the life of author and activist Helen Keller, when at the age of 7, her teacher Anne Sullivan, herself aged only 20, breaks through her students' disabilities to teach her the concept of language, that the symbols that she is forming in the girls' hands are the building blocks of everything that we use to communicate. To summarize the story, a little girl in Alabama loses both her sight and her hearing to a fever in 1882. Her father, Arthur Keller, hires a graduate of the Perkins School, a young lady named Anne Sullivan, who uses the most modern special education techniques to break through the child's disabilities. Seeing the public relations value of the success, the Perkins Institute publicizes the story, and Helen and Annie become international sensations. Helen received a formal education, graduating from Radcliffe College in 1904, and became a widely read author and social activist, campaigning for women's suffrage, women's civil rights, and became a tireless champion of the disabled. In 1924, she and Annie go to work for the newly established American Foundation for the Blind and become its worldwide face, traveling across the globe, raising funds and championing the blind. And by the time Helen Keller died in 1968, she had become an international icon. This year, after 3 years of negotiations, the American Foundation for the Blind, where Helen and Annie both worked from 1924 until their deaths, transferred their AFB Helen Keller archive to our museum here in Louisville at the American Printing House. AFB, after close to 100 years in New York, had moved their physical headquarters to a new operation in Virginia and had been looking for a landing spot for the collection. The Printing House is an old Louisville company founded in 1858 and located on Frankfort Avenue in the neighborhood of Clifton. And APH has grown to become the largest manufacturer of Braille and accessible educational materials in the world. But APH is much more than just a factory. It has become one of the main thought leaders for the entire field of blindness. And one component of being a thought leader is preserving and interpreting the stories of teachers and parents and students who contributed to the history of education and rehabilitation for people who are blind or visually impaired. And that's what we do in our museum, which opened in 1994. Every year, thousands of tourists and school children and scouts and homeschool groups and families, and yes, people who are blind themselves, take a tour of our factory, where they watch us make Braille and audiobooks and all sorts of technology. And their trip always concludes in the museum, where they get to see the roots of everything. The first books, the first Braille typewriters, the first embossing presses and recording technology, the first tactile maps, and so much else. After a trip to our museum, you walk away with a much different idea of what is possible. That blindness is just an obstacle to be circumvented, not a death sentence. And Helen Keller is an important component of that story. By the time Annie Sullivan's letters began arriving from Alabama back in Boston in the spring and summer of 1887, her supporters were already sharing them to encourage themselves and others, to raise money, to celebrate a success. And the newspapers and magazines of the day, as eager then as our story-hungry media is today to find a good story, they made Annie and Helen world famous. Even today, 50 years after her death, Helen Keller is still the most famous blind person in the world. Her story of overcoming adversity and doing it with a smile on her face is a useful tool if you're looking to dispel the gloom that lingers around disability, and asking people to look beyond the disability to the person underneath and the marvel of each and every one of us, our potential. Now, I could tell you 100 different and interesting stories about Keller. For most people, she is frozen in time as that little girl at the water pump, a scene made famous in the play by William Gibson and the various movies inspired by it. But Helen grows up to be a complicated and interesting woman, a woman passionately interested in the labor movement and the lives of the working class, who wrote so beautifully about socialism and socialist causes that she ends up with a nice thick file at J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. A woman of deep faith, inspired by the work of the Christian theologian Emanuel Swedenborg, a suffragette who marched with the ladies, a fervent pacifist who yet spent much of World War II touring hospital wards filled with wounded veterans, encouraging them to overcome their disabilities and resume their lives. She was an early supporter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Civil Rights Movement, and a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union, and he goes on and on. But given your organization's interests, I was asked this afternoon to talk a little bit about Keller's role as a diplomat and international peace advocate. For all of her life, Helen Keller was a great traveler. That first year of 1887, working with Anne Sullivan, she traveled north to Washington, D.C. and Boston and met the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland. She would meet almost every other president afterwards, most of them at the White House. And in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson presented her with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. Her story was published worldwide, and before she was even 12, she was personally corresponding with the kings and queens of Europe. She became a wonderful writer, a dedicated letter writer in particular, and she would publish 11 books and countless articles, most drafted initially on a Braille writer, and then typed up in print by Helen herself on her own typewriter before being edited by Annie or later by Annie's husband, John Macy, or their assistant, Polly Thompson. In 1913, Helen and Annie went on the lecture circuit, first on the formal and educational Chautauqua circuit, and then later on the more rowdy vaudeville circuit. Now, Annie hated that, but Helen loved it. She loved the makeup and the fancy clothes and the spectacle of it all. And throughout, she honed her public speaking and speechwriting skills. In 1924, as I mentioned, the pair went to work for the newly founded American Foundation for the Blind, primarily as cheerleaders and fundraisers. Their goal was to raise $1 million for the foundation endowment, and they traveled by train and car and buggy all over the nation, barnstorming the country, speaking before huge crowds and small, in train stations and Masonic halls and theaters and private drawing rooms, always encouraging and challenging and daring their listeners to believe that the lives of people who were blind or visually impaired, the lives of people who were deafblind, that these lives were valuable and that nothing was impossible. The pair took their first international trips in 1930, visiting Scotland, Ireland, and England, and in 1931, visiting France and Yugoslavia. These trips were supposed to be a vacation from the hustle and bustle of the fundraising road. Anne Sullivan Macy's health was never very good, but they always ended up being lured to more meetings and more parlors and more royal courts, where inevitably they were asked about what could be done for the blind. Now, after Annie Sullivan died in 1936, Helen Keller and Polly Thompson made their most ambitious tour to date in 1937 when they visited Japan and Manchuria and Korea. By this time, these trips were not vacations at all. Pictures of her trip to Japan show immense crowds gathered around their train, the kind of thing you might expect to see if a pope or national leader made a visit. Now, back in 1915, concerned about stories coming back from Europe about thousands of soldiers blinded in the trenches of Europe during World War I, Helen Keller joined with George Kessler, who was a Lusitania survivor who had stayed in Europe after that ship was sunk, and others to form what became known as the American Foundation for Overseas Blind. And that foundation still exists today, only now we know it as Helen Keller International. And in 1936, 30 years later, Helen began touring internationally on behalf of the American Foundation for Overseas Blind, expanding her advocacy for people with vision impairment worldwide. In 11 years, Helen and Polly would visit 35 countries on 5 continents. Her first trip was to Europe to tour the war-torn cities and assess the state of agencies serving people who were blind or visually impaired. Her itinerary for this first trip in 1946 was vague. In 1931, Helen had helped AFB host the World Congress of Workers for the Blind in New York City. And so her initial plans for her 1946 trip were anchored around visits to the various European leaders she had met in New York in 1931. Now, air travel in those days was a much different affair than today. Her plane left LaGuardia Airport in New York on October 17th, landed in Newfoundland to refuel, but was held until 4 p.m. the next day for repairs. There was no hotel. They waited all night in the terminal, where characteristically, as would always happen to Helen, they ran into somebody they knew, the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, John Gilbert Wynant. At dawn on the 19th, they landed in Ireland, ate breakfast, and then flew on to London. But expecting to land at Heathrow Airport, they found that the airport was fogged in. So they circled for a while, and then they had to fly back. This is how Helen remembers it. Quote, the Eclipse, that was the name of the airplane. Back then, they named airplanes the same way that you might name a liner, a ship. The Eclipse circled and circled in a futile attempt to reach the runway. We came down at a small airport 100 miles from London and waited to hear whether we should fly to the city or take the train. We had a plain but nice sandwich and a cup of tea. People at the airport were cheerful and friendly. 2 hours later, word was received that the fog at Heathrow had cleared, and we flew right to our destination. It was Saturday the 19th, and we should have been at Heathrow on the afternoon of the 17th. That was an example of the tedious waits and hard traveling we were to undergo in Europe. The newspaper men were already there asking why I had come to Europe and what my plans were. And here I wish to say that the next 2 months, wherever we went, we held countless press interviews. Most of the reporters were serious, intelligent in their questions about my work, and rendered service for which I am deeply grateful. Polly and I went to London to work, not to be entertained, but every time we walked or drove through the streets, the dreadful open wounds of the city I touched smote me. War-shattered houses, rows of buildings bombed past recognition or gone utterly, denuded chimney pots that seemed to mourn the homes they once guarded. We entered a church where bombs had fallen, and I passed my hand over its ruined walls and twisted girders. Yet people were still using it for service, and I sensed a genuineness of worship that ennobles the heart and sanctifies existence. As I pictured 1/5 of the whole city of London destroyed and heard of the vast, far-sighted projects to rebuild it, I was electrified by the people's onward marching pace. The sympathy that you can hear in Helen's voice as she talks about her travels and interacting with the people of this war-damaged city of London set the tone for much of her visit. She meets with workers who work with people who are blind. She meets with people who are blind themselves. She speaks with them. She touches them. She cries with them. She cheers them. She inspires them. And she speaks to their political leaders on their behalf. She talks to blinded servicemen, to children who had been blinded by the bombs, many terribly disfigured by their wounds. And meanwhile, she plans further trips, meeting with officials in the American embassy to arrange her travel onward. She was scheduled to leave on a commercial flight to Paris on November 8th, but the flight was canceled. So she pulls some strings to get an appointment at the U.S. Office of Priorities. She's trying to get seats on a military plane, which she did. When she arrives in Paris, she's met by officials from the U.S. Embassy, and they drive her to her hotel. And there again in Paris, they meet with leaders. They walk in a parade through the Arc de Triomphe. They meet with blinded veterans, and they share Helen's central message with any and all that, quote, the blind suffer not so much from lack of sight as from the wrong attitude of the public toward them, unquote. On November 16th, they leave on another army plane for Rome, which left Paris at midnight. Other than Helen and Polly, the only people on board this military plane is its pilot and a couple of other officers. Now, unlike their trips to London and Paris, they don't know anybody in Rome. There's nobody to meet the couple when the military plane's at the base. They get on the phone, they arrange for a car from the US Embassy, where they are met by the only official on duty, and she is not expecting them, but she connects them with another Army officer living there in Rome who takes them to his own home and feeds them lunch there with his family. Then they are hoping to get a plane to Greece. And while they're waiting for a plane that might take them to Greece, they improvise. They tour a home for blind children. They meet any Army officers who are there who will meet with them. They eat breakfast on El Duce's train, Benito Mussolini, the former Italian dictator. And then they talk their way on a plane down to Naples, Italy. And in Naples, while awaiting a further plane to Greece, they hear of the destruction of the School for the Blind there in Naples, and they start talking to Army officers about what can be done to help. Then finally, they figure out a plane and they fly on to Athens. And Helen writes that the plane was crude in its framework and the seats hard, but now they are filled with a sense of adventure. Because really now they're off any schedule or plan. They're just winging it, right? Quote, Helen says, "There was about Athens the magic of the myths and adventures in which divinities and men had mingled. Under that spell, it seemed natural that we should arrive as we did, cleaving the air," unquote. Helen scrapped together a schedule. Helen and Polly tour schools for the blind, schools for deaf children. They get to climb up on the Acropolis and touch the pillars of the Parthenon. They visit blinded servicemen in the hospital. They visit an adult workshop where men who are blind are making mops and brooms for sale. And their last stop in Greece is to meet the King of Greece, King George, whom they urge to support efforts to improve conditions for his people. And as they are getting back on their plane to come back to Italy, they are met by a delegation from an alliance of workers' unions. Now, by now, word is getting out that they're in Italy. And when they get back to Italy, an Army general, a U.S. Army general, has arranged with the U.S. ambassador to Italy for Helen and Polly to go meet the Pope in his study at Vatican City. And while the Pope mumbles some vague praise of her work, Helen tells Pius XII that, quote, "Your Holiness's blessing should rest upon the blind of Italy in particular, not upon me. It will be an incalculable help to them if you publicly recognize their proved capabilities and see to it that they receive generous aid in their struggle for constructive activity and independence. Even in the presence of the highest and the mightiest leaders, Helen stays on task, stays on point, on message." They fly briefly back to Paris and then to London, where they are, of course, now summoned to an audience with Queen Elizabeth, the same queen who's still the Queen of England, right? And Helen and Polly are embarrassed because they had expected this to be a working trip, and so they haven't brought any formal attire, nothing that would be appropriate for a meeting with the Queen of England, right? But the Queen's secretary assures them that their, quote, short frocks, their short frocks will have to do. And so they meet the Queen, and again, they share their message. Helen and Polly are a hit wherever they go. And the US State Department is very impressed by the way the two can speak to both the common people and to the leaders and rulers. And Helen and Polly are projecting an entirely different sort of American power. Instead of projecting military power, which was, of course, emerging from World War II, the United States was the predominant world military power. Helen and Polly project more of a moral power. And the State Department sees a great advantage in in sending them as these goodwill ambassadors around the world. So much so that in 1948, General Douglas MacArthur, who was Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, not only approves her request to visit Japan, but makes sure that his staff takes care of them while they are on their trip. One of his chief of staff writes Helen, says, to make your visit as productive as possible and to lighten the detail of movement in Japan, you will have the free use of U.S. Army facilities, including quarters, meals, and transportation. Now there's no more playing it by ear. Helen's trips over the next few years are highly choreographed. The schedules are negotiated and planned in advance. She visits Australia, New Zealand, and Japan in 1948, South Africa and Rhodesia in 1951, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Israel in 1952, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Panama, and Mexico in 1953, India, Pakistan, Burma, the Philippines, and Japan again in 1955, Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, Austria, and Italy in 1956, and finally Iceland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark in 1957. By this time, Helen Keller is 77 years old. Polly Thompson had had a series of strokes, and the pair were no longer able to handle the rigors of the road, so that their 1957 flight from Copenhagen back to New York was their last together. Polly would die in 1960, and Helen would die in 1968. Now, the AFB Helen Keller archive is full of evidence of the magnitude of these Helen Keller visits around the world. Photographs and newspaper and magazine stories and correspondence and wonderful gifts and awards that her hosts would give her at every stop. Helen Keller was there to advocate for the disabled, but her visit also said to an often marginalized disabled community that you matter. Her access to the country's leaders allowed her to urge them towards action and to build bridges between the disabled community and those leaders that would last long after her visit. I want to show you just a few photographs from the collection just to give you an idea of what's there. The first picture was of Helen and Polly Thompson getting off of an airplane, they would be greeted when they would get off the airplane by dignitaries and huge crowds, and they always, arrived, as in this one, I think this is in Perth, Australia, wearing their nice hats and their outfits. Then they would be greeted by these huge crowds. You can barely see Helen Keller's face in the sea of Japanese well-wishers outside of the train at a train station. I think this one is in Osaka in 1937. But you see all of the American flags, being waved. And she's really being welcomed here as a hero by just this huge crowd. This is in São Paulo, Brazil. And often she would be whisked away to a reception, but always the crowds are everywhere. Another crowd in Japan, this one in 1948, outside the airport, just a photograph filled with people wanting to wish her well, and then army officers and police kind of trying to create a cordon to keep the two ladies from being washed away. This is in the Philippines in the mid-50s. Here, a lay of welcome as she's getting off the train. The train's in the background. A huge crowd is gathered around. They're all laughing and smiling, and the lady is putting a lay around. And then in the front, we see a radio broadcaster from DZFM has got his microphone there, and he's broadcasting live from this grand event of Helen Keller arriving. In Japan again, here they are. This is in 1948. They're in a car, waving grandly to the crowd. The crowd is all smiling and happy and very excited to see Helen. Again, this is in, I think this is in the airport in New Delhi in her trip to India. And again, she has the flowers, the huge flowers have been put around her neck, and not, there's police and officers and uniformed people and people smiling. Again, this is in India, and look at all the photographers, not only the former media photographers, but look off to the right-hand side there. There is a troop of Boy Scouts, and one of them has his little Kodak box camera out, taking a picture of the Grand Lady arriving at the airport. This is in South Africa. Of course, she would speak at both formal and informal events. There's a huge crowd of people have been gathered to hear her speak, and then this kind of rough and ready stage has been cobbled together out of 2x4s, and she's speaking. And then this is a great one here. And this is at the airport. So even before she's been allowed to get out of the airport, I think this is in Chile. She's speaking. So she speaks to groups, large, small. This another group of immense amount of people gathered, and if you'll look back behind in through the doorway, there's a stairwell, and the stairwell is also groaning with people just trying to get a glimpse of Helen and Polly. Then she would usually go off and would visit various institutions for the blind. Here we have an institution for blind children in India, a group. I think this was in Manchuria. A school for blind children, and then this was I think this is in Lebanon when she went to the Holy Lands, a school for blind children, and there they are posing. And then of course there would be all these dinners and grand banquets here. Polly and Helen are sitting at a big long table loaded. This is in Japan again, and you can see all the men in their suits are all watching Helen very carefully. They're fascinated with how can she do all these things? How can she travel and speak and eat? People are often amazed that people who are blind or visually impaired can do even the most simple things, and of course they're sitting here watching her. This is a great one. This is from her trip to South Africa. This is a group of Zulu dancers who've been brought in to entertain Helen. And of course, Helen couldn't see them. So she's been brought over and she's feeling their accoutrements. She has in her hands the tall feather that one of the dancers wears on a headdress. And of course, again, just like in the picture before where the Japanese men at dinner were sitting there staring, at this odd American woman, here some of the South African men who are watching the whole event are standing back behind the whole thing, watching her look at the dancers. And, you can see the look of curiosity on their face, wondering, how does Helen Keller do all the things that she does? And my last picture is a bunch of these dancers in their full regalia, waving goodbye to Helen as she heads off. So I'm really looking forward to working with these archives to better understand Helen Keller's role as a peace ambassador over the coming months and years, and sharing those stories with our visitors to the museum. And I think we have some time now, so if you have any questions about the collection or Keller's life or APH, I'll be glad to take those questions now.
Great. Thank you, Mike. That was so fascinating. As you were talking about and reading from her writings, it's so hard to imagine that this was written by someone who is blind, because she's got such vivid descriptions. I mean, if you didn't know, you would never have guessed. I don't think anybody generally would be able to write as vividly as she did.
Yeah, we're all lucky to have certain gifts, right? Everybody has different kinds of gifts, and you can look at somebody like Helen Keller and say, she lost her hearing, she lost her sight. You could see those only as deficits, right? But somehow or other, when she was being created in her mother's womb, she is born with just this amazing gift for language. And so once her teacher, Anne Sullivan, is able to teach her how to use finger spelling in her hand, and then the Braille alphabet to read and write. Almost immediately, she's writing letters to people. She is the most amazing writer. Type in Helen Keller quotes on your Google, and she is just perfect. For being someone who's a fundraiser, those types of people need to figure out how to communicate things in just a few words. And Helen is great at coming up with catchphrases and bylines. And yeah, she's an amazing writer, amazing writer.
Yeah, and the fact that she and Polly, they were able to navigate all these different countries before becoming the, kind of an official, having that title in all these countries at that time is pretty incredible as well. So, I mean, one of the things I think that your talk have really highlighted for us is very similar to the work that we do at the World Affairs Council, which is, someone having that ability to really break down the stereotypes. Being blind and having other disabilities in most cultures is a bit of a stigma. And people, as you say, talking, in Japan, just imagining how this person is able to be so normal in terms of what they would otherwise see as impossible. So that is something that we can all really learn from. I'm going to go ahead and ask you some of the questions that came through. I see, if you give me one quick question. Okay, we have one question. Asks, the typical knowledge of Helen Keller is that she was blind and deaf and with help from a teacher learned to communicate. Why do you think that it isn't common knowledge that she helped found the ACLU or was a suffragette, or that she traveled internationally extensively, or was close with Mark Twain? Will the new exhibit touch on these more unknown facets of her life?
Yes, it absolutely will. Because everybody is a circle, right? We're all circles. A lot of times people only see one facet of us. So for Helen, she is kind of frozen in time, not only because of the media accounts when she was young, but even more important for our generation, by William Gibson's play, The Miracle Worker. So you may have seen the play, you may have seen the movies, and that telling of just a few months of her and Annie's life in that summer of 1887, where she learns how to communicate, that very much captured the imagination. But then afterwards, it's almost like people wanted to keep her in that box. Like they were more comfortable with Helen as a little girl, very safe, who had done something amazing, but who didn't poke them too much, right? It's possible that we want all of our heroes to be very simple people. We're uncomfortable letting, this deaf blind girl. I mean, in fact, you can look at newspaper accounts of her visits to, say, I'm going to pick Kansas City because I've seen it recently. In the 1930s, the woman is 50 years old, but the headline says, deaf and blind girl visits Kansas City. She's 50, but they want her to be a certain thing. Maybe we don't want Helen to be a suffragist. Maybe we don't want her to be a civil rights advocate. Maybe that makes us uncomfortable if she starts prodding and poking us and asking us to be bigger and better than we think we can be. So I think it's the media accounts of her life try to keep her as this simple, unspoiled little girl. And I think also that some of her ideas make us uncomfortable. And, she was a socialist. Okay, she was. Well, I mean, right now we're having a big national debate over whether or not, is that a bad word or a good word, right? Even people who think it's a good word probably are a little uncomfortable about the way it's used. So, Helen, this is what she did, okay? She looked out at the world and she saw injustice. She saw that the lives of working people were hard, that they lived in substandard housing, that their employment was insecure, and that they could be fired at a moment's whim. They had a lot of food insecurity, and she thought that was wrong. And the people who, it seemed to her, in the 19 teens and 1920s, that were saying the things that she wanted to hear about, what are we going to do about all of this injustice, were people who also identified as socialists, right? So, you know, we can debate whether that's a good word or a bad word now, but that makes people uncomfortable. So I think the reason we don't know more about the full life of Helen Keller is that we want her to be a much simpler thing. But yes, we're going to tell all those stories. We're going to try and look at what makes a hero, right? What are the qualities of someone who is a hero? But we're definitely going to explore all of Helen's many facets. Good question.
Yeah, that was a very good question, and also a great answer. I think you're absolutely right. Every time we talk about heroes, we always ask what is his or her superpower, and it's always implied that one power that is unique from everything else, and we don't like to get too confused by too many powers.
Yeah.
So that is a very interesting point. We have a couple of other questions. I have one. Will the exhibit have any portion of the FBI file on her? Why was she under surveillance, and what were her thoughts about that?
Okay, so you can literally go online to the site where all those FBI files have been made public, and you can read her entire file. I recommend that you do it. The interesting thing is, see, anybody who belongs to certain organizations is under investigation, right? So Helen belongs to the Socialist Party, okay? Therefore, she's under investigation. She publishes some things in some magazines in support of various strikes that occur in the 20s and 30s. And sometimes she is a little naive about Russia. She is, especially in the 20s and the 30s, she praises Russia a lot without knowing all of the terrible things that Stalin and his government are doing kind of in the background. And so at times she almost gets used a little bit by some American communist organizations. But as soon as she figures out what's going on, she immediately backs away from those connections. And it never really progresses farther than assembling a file. I mean, the FBI is assembling files on thousands of Americans. You know, anybody who engages in any kind of activity that might be seen as questionable, they are investigating you and they assemble a file. But I can't give you the link right off the top of my head right now, but I have read through her file and it's very interesting reading.
Great. Yes, it's a bit of a badge of honor if the FBI is going to have a file on you, huh?
Let me tell you one story on that
Sure,
score of badge of honor. So as a socialist, most of her writing, by the way, has nothing to do with socialism, okay? But every now and then she writes things about socialism. And so in 1933, when the German Student Union, under the influence of the Nazi Party, is cleansing the German libraries, all of Helen's books end up on those big piles of burning books. And Helen hears about it, and she writes a letter to Chancellor Adolf Hitler, basically telling him that he is going to be toast. So I think, yeah, you know, another badge of honor is that the Nazis didn't like her very much. So if you pick your enemies carefully, yeah, it can be a good thing, right?
Yes, she's a very courageous woman. We have one question I ask. With all that Helen Keller accomplished both internationally and in the US, what do you consider her biggest triumph or most lasting impact would be?
I think that's a really hard question, and I don't have now. Helen would be able to spout something here immediately because she was good that way. I think her number one contribution was to cause sighted people who would just routinely dismiss someone who was disabled as helpless and worthless. I think she challenged them to rethink that attitude and to rethink what might be possible.
That's a great point. Well, I mean that just the everything that she's done has really spoken to that by her own life example, as well as what she has been, just the following that she received from the general public everywhere she went. That's kind of a real evidence of her impact on people in general.
Well, you know, in some of those photographs, you can see the airline guys watching her come down this pretty rickety roll-up stairs without anybody holding her, and you can tell in their mind they're going, you know. And,
Right.
and sometimes it's, you know, the fact that people who are blind or vision impaired can do even they put their pants on one leg at a time. You know,
Mm-hmm.
they read, they aspire, they dream, they hope, they cook, right? They enjoy. You know, Helen liked an old fashioned, you know, which if you like cocktails, you know, it's a great cocktail. That was her favorite cocktail. So she, you know, after a long day, she might sit down and have an old fashioned. Well, a lot of those things, you know, they cause us to think about our preconceptions.
Well, then she's her collection is in the right place right now, isn't it?
I think so.
I think so. Well, I'm going to end this with one last question for you, really about APH. You know, I know the pandemic has been very difficult, certainly, because the museum's not open. Very few people are actually able to see this wonderful collection. You know, what would you like people to know about APH, you know, that they don't already know now during this time especially? And I'm sure everybody's really looking forward to the day when it opens and be able to see all of this collection that you've been talking about. But something that you can tell us, you know, what people should take away about this American Printing House for the Blind.
So the printing house, as I said, is the largest manufacturer of Braille and educational aids. So we still do about 16 or 17 million pages of Braille every year. And we are the official supplier of textbooks to all American school children, K through 12. So if you're in Alabama, Oregon, or Massachusetts, you know, those kids are using textbooks that are made in Braille at APH, but we're also a high-tech company. We just introduced a couple of new Braille embossers. Those are, if you think about a printer, it's the printer that embosses in Braille rather than in print. We have a couple of new handheld refreshable Braille devices. So you can literally put an entire book on a refreshable Braille device. It raises pins up to create the Braille dots. You can only ever read a line of text at a time anyways, even in print. So it creates one line of text for you to read at a time and just keeps constantly giving you a new line as you need it. We're also working on navigation. We have a spinoff of the printing house called Nearby Explorer. And it's working on a cell phone application that you can take anywhere in the country and use to tell you, you know, that what street you're on, what direction you're facing, and how far it is to the coffee shop, you know, that you're trying to get to, and which direction it is. Kind of working towards the goal of a turn-by-turn pedestrian navigation, like cars use turn-by-turn auto navigation. We've got a project right now with Lego. We just came out with Lego building blocks, but instead of the traditional Lego dots on top, instead they are in the shape of the Braille characters. You can still build anything you want with them, but they're also a Braille education device. So lots of different things going on at the printing house, and none of that has stopped for the COVID. Our production staff, we've reconfigured the factory so that our production staff still comes in every day and they're working in a safe format. And then a lot of the rest of us are working from home. And I too can't wait until we can all be back together again. right?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a good point. And thank you for all you do and all of the things that APH does for not just being part of this community, but I know internationally for the work that you've done. And thank you so much for this really interesting, fascinating look into Helen Keller's life, about part of her that probably many of us don't know, and certainly our audience will be really interested. So thank you, Mike.
Thank
And
you.
we will be having some of the recording. We're going to have the recording today in case anybody misses it. But if anyone would like more information about the work and exhibit, do visit their website, aph.org. And we'll all make sure to come back when the museum opens. And just as a reminder for everybody out here, we at World Affairs Council, we've rolled out quite a number of virtual series. This local lunch and learn is monthly and always at noon and always free. So we hope that more you will join us every month for one of these programs. In addition, our signature speaker series is also going virtual, and they feature national experts, authors, and diplomats discussing current global issues. Our first one is going to be next Wednesday, September 16th, featuring Angela Stent. She's a former diplomat, expert and author of the book Putin's World, Russia Against the West and the Rest. So as we were talking about, some things don't change in history. You can find out all about this program and many of the other virtual series on our website, worldkentucky.org. I hope you will join us and consider supporting WAC by becoming a member. And with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and please stay well and healthy. And we hope to see you again next time. Thanks again, Mike. Bye-bye, everyone.